The night the rumor first reached the Quai des Orfèvres, Inspector Moreau had been standing by the window of his office, watching the pale fog curl above the Seine like a living, breathing thing. Paris often whispered to him through its mists, but that night the whisper felt heavier, as though the stones themselves were waiting for him to interpret what they already knew. Somewhere in the labyrinth of narrow streets beyond the Pont Neuf, a man who had taken a life, deliberately, savagely, without hesitation, had done something so unexpected, so confounding, that even the hardened patrolmen in the cafes could not decide whether to call him a monster or a savior. The strangest part, the part that made Moreau's hand pause above the matchbox as he tried to light his pipe, was how quickly the story had begun to mutate. Some said the man had changed out of guilt. Others whispered he had done it to protect someone nameless. A few claimed he sought redemption, though redemption rarely walks openly in Paris. Moreau had seen criminals pretend to be saints, and saints crumble into criminals, but this tale felt different. It carried the cold edge of truth mixed with the warmth of impossible emotion, like the scent that lingers after a kerosene lamp has just been extinguished. And somewhere within it, he sensed a pattern threading toward him, drawing him deeper, as though an unseen hand were guiding the pieces of a puzzle he had not yet realized he was solving. The night air drifting into his office was tinged with river damp and the distant murmur of late drinkers, but beneath it all lay something else. The unmistakable tension of a city about to reveal a secret it had long kept buried. If stories like this one keep your curiosity awake long after the lamps have dimmed, stay close. Like the Seine, these mysteries run deep, and your support, your voice, your presence, helps them continue to flow. If you feel drawn into this world, consider lingering a moment to like, share, or subscribe. It keeps the doors of Moreau's Paris open for you. Inspector Moreau first sensed the shape of the story before he heard a single detail, the way a man feels the pressure of a coming storm long before the first distant thunder. It was early, the sort of grey Paris morning when the fog sits low and sluggish along the Seine, clinging to the arches of the Pont Neuf and curling into the narrow alleys like a patient intruder. Moreau had arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres earlier than usual, hoping for a quiet hour with his notes before the day began its usual chorus of footsteps, murmurings, and small bureaucratic demands. But silence never stayed long in police headquarters, and he knew this as soon as he caught the uneven rhythm of boots approaching his door. It was Lucas, heavy, dependable, rarely rattled. Yet there was something different in the way he hesitated before knocking, as if the news he carried had not fully settled in his own mind. When Lucas stepped inside, his mustache beaded with moisture from the mist outside, he took off his hat slower than usual. "There's something you'll want to hear," he said, voice pitched low, almost cautious. He did not sit. Moreau closed the ledger before him and leaned back in his chair, giving the man space to speak. Lucas glanced toward the window, toward the grey blur of the river beyond, and cleared his throat. The rumor, he said, had come in from a patrolman stationed near Rue de Lille. One of those young fellows who still carried a nervous edge to his duties, the type who noticed too much at the edges of a quiet shift. He had seen a girl, no more than 8 or 9, crying beside a small fire-charred cart. And beside her, just visible in the haze, a man disappearing into the alley's mouth. A tall man with a pale face, a man the patrolman recognized from a circulated description given only days before. A suspect wanted for a killing near the riverbank. The strangeness didn't come from the sighting. It came from the girl's breathless account. She insisted the man had saved her from the flames that had erupted when a kerosene lamp tipped over in her family's courtyard. She said he had run straight into the smoke, lifted her into his arms, and carried her out before retreating without a word, leaving her trembling and half convinced she had been rescued by a ghost. Moreau listened without interrupting, absorbing each detail with the calm intensity that had become his habit over the years. Lucas continued, describing how the patrolman had tried to run after the man, but lost him almost immediately in the lattice of alleys. It could have been a coincidence. It could have been a frightened child inventing a savior. It could have been an error of identification by a patrolman who wanted to believe he had been at the center of something unusual. But something in Lucas's tone suggested he doubted all those explanations, and something in Moreau's intuition told him to take the matter seriously. Strange contradictions had a way of pointing to hidden truths, especially in Paris, where the boundaries between guilt and grace often blurred beneath the soft lamps of the quay. Moreau rose, buttoned his coat, and followed Lucas into the corridor, where the familiar scent of damp wood and old paper lingered. He lit his pipe, letting the flame flare briefly before settling into a steady glow. The fog outside was thick enough to soften the city's noise, giving the impression that Paris was holding its breath. As they walked down the steps and out to the embankment, Moreau felt the subtle pressure of expectation pressing in from the river, as though the city wanted him to listen closely. They made their way to Rue de Lille, moving through streets that felt half awake. The cafes were only beginning to stir, chairs still stacked, shutters half drawn. Moreau noticed a paper boy standing at a corner, stamping his feet to keep warm, calling out headlines about a factory strike and an upcoming ministerial announcement. Ordinary matters that felt strangely trivial against the faint tremor of the story forming around him. When they reached the courtyard, the smell of burned wood still hung in the air. The girl sat on a stool beside her mother, who was arguing softly with a neighbor about whether the lamp had been faulty or whether the wind had slipped through a cracked window. Moreau crouched before the girl and asked her gently to describe the man once more. She did so with surprising clarity, her eyes drifting toward the darkened alley as though expecting him to reappear. She recalled the way he hesitated after setting her down, the way his shoulders lowered, not in exhaustion but in a kind of shame. Moreau noted that detail. Shame was a peculiar companion for a man who had just saved a life. A guilty man might feel it. A man who had lost someone once might feel it. A man grappling with the weight of his own nature might feel it too. He stood and walked deeper into the alley where the man had fled. The cobblestones were slick, glistening faintly in the morning light. The walls retained the blackened smudges of smoke, and near a rain pipe he found the remnants of a small candle stub, half melted and still carrying a faint scent of beeswax. It meant nothing by itself. Yet in this case, it felt like a fingerprint of intention, someone who had planned to enter darkness, someone who needed guidance but could not risk carrying a lamp. Lucas joined him, hands shoved into his coat pockets. "Do you think he really saved her?" he asked. "I think she believes it," Moreau replied, turning the candle between his fingers. "And belief often comes from truth's shadow." They followed the alley to its end, where it opened onto a street lined with modest apartments. A milk cart rattled past, and an elderly man with a cane watched them with mild suspicion before turning into a bakery. Moreau's gaze swept the surroundings, noting the angles of the buildings, the escape routes, the hidden corners. He felt the peculiar sensation of being pulled into the orbit of a man he had not yet seen. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Moreau studied the suspect's file again. The killing had occurred on a rain-soaked night near the river. The victim, a smuggler known for violence and threats, had been found with a single fatal blow to the temple. Witnesses had described the killer as calm, almost eerily composed. There had been no signs of panic, no reckless fleeing, just a quiet disappearance into the night. Now that same man had plunged into smoke to save a child. It made no sense. Or perhaps it made more sense than anything else. Human beings were rarely driven by a single motive. Moreau sensed layers beneath the surface, an internal struggle only the man himself could articulate. He thought of the girl's trembling voice, of the mother's confusion, of the candle that still smelled faintly of beeswax. As the Day slipped toward afternoon. Moreau returned to his office. The fog outside had finally begun to lift, revealing the muted glimmer of water moving slowly beneath the bridges. He sat heavily at his desk, pipe between his teeth, and allowed the morning's impressions to form something like a beginning. This was no ordinary pursuit. It wasn't merely a matter of finding a criminal. It felt like tracking a man caught between two forces within himself. One dark, one luminous, each trying to claim him. Moreau knew he would find him eventually. Paris was wide, but conscience created narrow paths. And somewhere in the city, the man who had killed and saved in the same breath was walking those paths now, unaware that with every step he took, he pulled Moreau deeper into the mystery of who he truly was. The story of the little girl in the smoky courtyard lingered in Moreau's mind long after he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres. It stayed with him through the evening, clinging like the fog that refused to lift from the river banks. Paris had a way of holding on to certain details, repeating them softly until they took on the weight of inevitability, and the image of a pale-faced man carrying a child from the flames echoed in Moreau's thoughts with quiet persistence. By the time dawn broke again, thin, yellow, and reluctant, he already knew he would return to Rue de Lille, not to search for new evidence, but to absorb the atmosphere, the emotional texture that often revealed truths sharper than any report. When he arrived, the neighborhood felt different. A night can transform a street in Paris, especially one touched by fear and gratitude in the same breath. Children whispered to one another in the doorways. Their mothers stood beside them, backs straight, discussing the strange turn of events. Moreau sensed that the story of the mysterious rescuer had already begun its journey through the city, gathering embellishments and quiet astonishment as it went. But the girl, the one who had actually lived those harrowing moments, sat quietly on the steps with her hands clasped in her lap, watching the alley with the solemn curiosity only survivors possess. Moreau approached her mother again, who recognized him instantly and dipped her head with a mix of respect and fatigue. The night had not been kind to her. She guided him back into the courtyard, where the charred beams still smoked faintly, leaving behind a scent that carried both the sweetness of burned wood and the darker tang of fear. She didn't sleep much, the mother murmured. Every time she closed her eyes, she said she saw his face. Not with fear. More like she didn't understand why he ran. The girl lifted her gaze to Moreau. Her eyes were still red from the smoke, but they held a clarity that struck him like a sudden gust of wind. He sat beside her on the step. She wasn't timid this morning. Rather, she seemed determined, as though speaking to him was a task she had already prepared herself for. He came out of the fire like he knew exactly where to go, she said softly. I didn't see him before the lamp fell, but when the flames went high, he was suddenly there, running through them. He didn't cough. He didn't shout. He just lifted me up. Moreau listened without looking away. Children rarely crafted stories with adult logic, which made their accounts occasionally disjointed but often painfully honest. Did he say anything to you? He asked. The girl shook her head. Not a word. But he looked sad, as if saving me made him sad. That caught Moreau's attention more than anything. Sadness was an odd companion for heroism. He let the silence stretch, allowing her memory to unfurl on its own. I touched his hand, she said, almost whispering. It was cold, not like someone who ran through fire. Cold hands moving through heat, a pale face marked by shame rather than urgency. A man who vanished before gratitude could reach him. Moreau felt the subtle tightening of a thread pulling him deeper. He stood and walked again to the alley where the man had disappeared. Morning light squeezed through the narrow opening, illuminating the soot marks with unexpected tenderness. The candle stub from the day before still lay where he had left it, small and unimpressive, but its presence felt oddly deliberate. A man who brought a candle into danger, meant to be unseen, yet prepared. Not impulsive, not panicked, intentional. Lucas arrived soon after, breath visible in the cool air. He carried a paper in his hand, one of the morning editions. "The press caught the story sooner than we hoped," he said with a grimace. "They're calling him the Silent Samaritan." Moreau sighed. Parisian newspapers had a talent for poetic naming, but this one bothered him. It wrapped the man in an aura of nobility that might not belong to him. "Do we know how much was embellished?" Lucas shrugged. "It's the press. They exaggerate even the fog." Moreau scanned the printed lines briefly. They mentioned a mysterious figure who saved a child from flames, then vanished. There was no mention of the killing, not yet. But once the press connected the two, the story would accelerate uncontrollably. Moreau felt a flicker of unease. A city-wide fascination could drive the man further into hiding, or push him toward acts more desperate and unpredictable. He decided to follow the man's path as the patrolman had described it. Step by step, he moved down the alley, crossed the narrow street, and entered another small passage connecting to Rue de Beaune. Each turn felt purposeful, as though the suspect had known exactly where he was going. Moreau imagined the tall figure slipping through the mist, coat drawn close, candle extinguished but still warm in his pocket. He could almost hear the sound of quiet footsteps against the stones, the measured pace of someone accustomed to fleeing, not from law, but from himself. At the end of Rue de Beaune, a small cafe was just opening. Moreau stepped inside, letting the warmth welcome him. He ordered a black coffee, more for the opportunity to observe than for thirst. The patrons were few. A baker eating his breakfast roll, a seamstress with ink-stained fingers, and a thin young man reading the same newspaper Lucas had shown him. Moreau questioned the owner, a broad-shouldered man with a brisk manner. He had seen no suspicious figures, he claimed, though he added thoughtfully that he had noticed someone standing across the street the previous night for quite some time. "Tall, quiet," he said. "Didn't order anything. Just watched the street like a man expecting an answer that never came." Moreau left a coin on the counter and stepped back into the shifting fog. He walked further along the suspect's imagined route until he reached the small square near Église Saint-Thomas d'Aquin. Here, the city seemed to release some of its tension, the air lighter, the space wider. If the man had intended to disappear, this was a perfect crossroads. Several streets, multiple directions, each leading to different worlds within Paris. But Moreau's focus returned to the peculiar detail, the candle. Why carry a candle into danger? A lamp or torch would have drawn attention. A match would have been too brief. A candle burned steadily and quietly, casting a small, gentle circle of light. A candle is humble, deliberate, almost intimate. It hinted at a man accustomed to darkness, a man who moved with caution, who expected shadows not only around him, but within him. Back at headquarters, Moreau called for Janvier, whose methodical nature often complemented his own intuition. They reviewed the case again from the beginning. The victim, Henri Valois, had been a smuggler tied to violent disputes in both Paris and provincial towns. His death had not sparked widespread shock among the criminal circles, which made the suspect's odd mixture of ferocity and gentleness all the more perplexing. A man who killed Valois would normally have celebrated, hidden, or fled the country entirely. Saving a child was not part of that pattern, unless the killing and the saving came from the same source, a twisted, complex desire to correct a past wrong. Moreau rubbed his temples, feeling the faint pressure of a truth he couldn't yet articulate. He knew the suspect was not simply avoiding arrest. The man was trying to outrun something internal, something far more persistent than the law. And Moreau, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his life listening beneath the surface of confessions, felt the beginning of a strange, reluctant sympathy, the kind that made pursuit heavier, more delicate. Paris outside was shifting again into evening, lights flickering alive one by one along the quays. As he stood before the window, pipe ember glowing faintly, Moreau imagined the tall figure somewhere out there, lighting another candle, in a room he didn't belong to, preparing himself for another night of wandering the thin line between guilt and salvation. The candle, the child, the pale face. All of it formed the start of a pattern he could no longer ignore. By the time Inspector Moreau reached Rue Saint-Denis that afternoon, Paris had begun its slow transition into evening, the kind of late hour when the shadows deepen not abruptly, but with a patient heaviness, settling over the streets like a tired sigh. The lamps along the boulevard flickered one by one, pushing back the dusk with small halos of amber light. It was in this softened half-darkness that he approached the building where the widow lived, a modest structure wedged between a faded tailor shop and a cafe whose tables were always full of men who whispered too loudly for anyone to believe they had real secrets. The widow's building had an air of melancholy to it, old, leaning slightly, its walls stained by years of Parisian weather and quiet disappointments. Moreau felt a familiar tightening in his chest as he climbed the narrow stairway, gripping the railing worn smooth by countless hands before his. He had spoken to many widows in his career. Loss had a universal scent that clung to their homes no matter the district, a mixture of dust, preserved clothing, and something faintly sweet, as though they still tried to keep life warm in rooms that no longer knew how to hold it. When he reached her door, he knocked softly. A pause followed, long enough for him to imagine she was deciding whether to open the door to yet another man in a dark coat. Then, slowly, the latch clicked and the door inched open. She was small, her posture slightly bent, her hair pulled back in a grey bun that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Her eyes, though, held an alertness that jarred against the rest of her weary frame. She studied him for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The room was lit by a single kerosene lamp on the table, its flame wavering gently in the current from a cracked window. The furniture was simple but carefully arranged, and the air carried the faint aroma of lavender soap. "You're the inspector," she said, without asking his name. "The neighbors told me you might come." Moreau nodded, removing his hat and setting it on the small round table near the door. "Madame Fournier?" She nodded. "Yes." He waited for her to sit before pulling up a chair himself. She folded her hands on her lap and looked toward the window, as though the darkening street held the answers she was afraid to voice. Moreau had learned to let silence do its work. It softened people, coaxed out truths they were reluctant to share. Finally, she exhaled, a thin, trembling sound. "You're looking for him," she said. "The man everyone is talking about." Moreau leaned slightly forward. "You've seen him?" Her jaw tightened in a way that revealed both fear and memory. "I saw him 3 times. The first was a month ago. I was carrying groceries, far too heavy for me, and he appeared behind me, took the bags without a word, and walked me all the way up the stairs. He didn't say his name. He didn't look at me directly. He left the bags inside my door and disappeared before I could even thank him." Moreau absorbed this quietly. The man's pattern, appearing suddenly, helping silently, fleeing without acknowledgement, fit perfectly with what he had heard so far. But the widow's next words carried a heavier weight. "The second time," she continued, her fingers tightening around each other, "I was outside the butcher's. I dropped my purse. Everything spilled. People walked past without stopping. It's a busy street, Inspector, you know how it is. But he came from nowhere again, gathering each coin, each paper, placing them carefully into my hand, as though afraid he might break me if he moved too quickly." Moreau listened, studying her tone. These were not the words of a woman inventing details. She recounted them with the careful reverence of someone who had been startled by kindness after expecting indifference. "And the third time?" he asked gently. She hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the lamplight. 2 weeks ago, I heard a quarrel outside late at night. 2 men shouting. I'm used to such things on this street, so I didn't interfere. But then I saw him again through the curtains. He wasn't shouting. He stood still watching them. When they turned on him, he stepped back as though uninterested in fighting, but there was something in his face, something wounded, like a man who's been broken once and fears being broken again. Moreau felt a faint chill glide along his spine. Did he say anything? A single word, she whispered. He said, enough. Not loudly, not with anger, more like a plea. Silence enveloped the room as she pressed a hand to her cheek. And then he left, quickly, almost ran. I watched him disappear down the street, and I knew in my bones, Inspector, that something was tormenting him. He studied her profile for a moment, noting the softness that crept into her expression. She pitied the man, perhaps even feared for him. Such emotions complicated the clarity of crime, blurring the lines Moreau worked so hard to maintain. Still, the widow's account added another layer to the portrait taking shape. A man moving through life with the quiet urgency of someone who had no place to rest, no identity he dared keep. Madame Fournier, Moreau said, choosing his words carefully. Why didn't you tell anyone before? She turned her gaze fully to him for the first time. Her eyes were moist, glimmering faintly in the lamplight. Because he never frightened me. Not once. And because... She paused, swallowing thickly. Because I recognized grief in him. A kind I've carried myself. When my husband died, I walked the streets like a ghost for months. No one saw me, no one cared, but that man... She placed a hand over her heart, as if feeling some echo of a long-forgotten tenderness. He saw me. Moreau felt something stir deep within him, an involuntary sympathy that brushed against the stern professional shell he maintained. The suspect had no pattern of cruelty except for the killing of Valois, and even that act felt clouded by something more complicated than malice. Did he ever mention Valois? Moreau asked. Her answer came immediately. No, but the night he saw the 2 men quarreling, one of them mentioned Valois' name. She straightened, her eyes narrowing as memory sharpened. I couldn't hear everything, but I heard enough. One said, if Valois were alive, you'd never dare. And the other replied something like, I'm glad he's gone. The man you're looking for, he froze when he heard that. Completely froze, as though the words cut him. Moreau's breath deepened. Are you sure? Absolutely. He rose slowly, pacing toward the window. Outside, the street glowed under gas lamps, the faint hum of distant conversation drifting upward. Somewhere down below, a man coughed, a carriage rattled by, and a cat darted across the road. But beneath all of that, Moreau sensed another presence, one that had left marks in the air even in its absence. When he turned back toward her, the widow was trembling slightly. Inspector, she said, voice thin with apprehension. I have the feeling he's been watching me since then, not in a frightening way, more like checking that I'm safe. Has he spoken to you since? No, but twice now. I've opened my door in the morning and found coins left on the mat. Not many. Just enough to buy bread. Enough to remind me someone remembers I exist. Moreau's mind worked rapidly. The man was moving through the city like a shadow with a conscience, trying to right small wrongs, ease small pains, while carrying a burden he could not set down. Killers did not usually behave like this, but men suffering from guilt, real guilt, the kind that hollows out a person, often did. When he finally took his leave, descending the narrow stairs once more, he felt eyes following him. At first he thought it was the widow watching from her window, but as he stepped into the street, he sensed something else, a pair of unseen eyes in the shadows, silent, observant, the kind of presence that barely touches the world, like a figure passing through the edges of a dream. Moreau turned sharply, scanning the dim street, the alleys, the rooftops. Nothing. No movement. No sound except the faint murmur of the cafe nearby. But the sensation lingered, prickling at the back of his neck. The man had been here recently. Perhaps minutes before. Moreau walked slowly down Rue Saint-Denis, his footsteps deliberate, his senses attuned to the smallest sound. The night had settled fully now, and the lamps flickered in a faint breeze. He felt the tension of pursuit tighten. This was no longer a hunt for a criminal, but for a man balancing on the fragile edge between redemption and collapse. And as he moved deeper into the street, he knew with absolute certainty that the widow's account had changed something irrevocable. The suspect was no longer a faceless killer in a file. He had become someone painfully human, someone torn between darkness and the desperate desire to somehow escape it. And Moreau felt, with a quiet ache, that the man was closer than anyone realized. Watching, waiting, perhaps hoping to be caught. Inspector Moreau had revisited crime scenes countless times throughout his career, but the alley where Valois had been killed possessed a peculiar stillness that unsettled him each time he passed through its narrow entrance. It lay behind a row of derelict buildings near the river, a forgotten corridor where the city seemed to breathe more slowly, as though reluctant to disturb whatever lingered there. On most days, the alley was deserted except for a few stray cats and the occasional drunkard stumbling home. But on the morning Moreau returned, even they were absent, leaving the air thick with an uneasy quiet. The sky hung low, a muted wash of gray, and the damp cold pressed into his coat like fingers of a persistent memory. He paused just before entering, letting the place settle around him. Every crime scene held echoes, some faint, some overwhelming, and Valois' death carried both. Underneath the physical facts lay something intangible, something emotional that had seeped into the very stones. A man had died here, violently and without ceremony, yet the air did not feel charged with rage or panic. Instead, it bore an eerie calm, as if the killing had been neither impulsive nor muddled, but executed with a single, deliberate stroke. Moreau stepped forward, boots scraping lightly against the uneven ground. The cobblestones still bore faint, dark stains, the remnants of Valois' blood. Rain had washed most of it away in the days since the murder, but a trained eye recognized what remained, clinging stubbornly to the cracks between stones. Moreau crouched, letting his gloved fingers hover just above the marks. He wasn't touching history. He was reading it. It was an old habit of his, to linger on details most inspectors overlooked. The official report stated that Valois had been struck once, a blow delivered with force and accuracy, sending him collapsing to the ground before he had the chance to cry out. It was the kind of blow delivered by someone who understood violence intimately. Not a reckless street brawl strike, but something colder. Moreau could almost picture the posture, the angle, the proximity. A professional? Possibly. But the presence of panic, always present with professionals when things go wrong, was missing. There were no erratic footprints, no signs of a struggle, no hurried attempts to conceal the body. The killer had walked away in a measured manner, leaving Valois to bleed into the cracks of the alley. Moreau rose and stepped further along the wall, tracing the suspect's potential exit path. The walls here were close enough that a man could lean his shoulder against them for support, yet high enough to trap the shadows in perpetual dimness. As he ran his palm across the chipped stone, he noticed something subtle, a smear, faint but purposeful, at shoulder height. A touch that didn't speak of desperation, but of hesitation. A pause. He closed his eyes, imagining the man standing there moments after the act, breathing shallowly, unsure whether he had just committed justice or doom. To Moreau, that hesitation revealed more than any confession could have. Killers rarely pause unless something inside them cracks. That moment of leaning against the wall felt like the beginning of a transformation, a rupture between who the man had been before the blow and who he became after. It was as though he needed the cold stone to steady himself, to feel anchored while the enormity of his own action reverberated through him. A distant sound, a cart rumbling over uneven pavement, reminded Moreau where he was. He turned toward the open end of the alley, where Janvier approached with a folder tucked under his arm. Janvier's breath billowed into the morning air in small white bursts. "You're here early," Janvier remarked, offering a faint nod of acknowledgement. "Places like this don't reveal themselves unless you give them time," Moreau replied, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Did you bring the file?" Janvier handed it over. "I thought you might want the witness statements again, especially the woman who lives upstairs." Moreau flipped through the pages, though he didn't need to. He had memorized every line days ago. The woman, Madame Laroche, claimed she had heard a muted thud, then footsteps moving steadily away. She hadn't seen the killer's face, but she had described the rhythm of the steps, measured, neither hurried nor confident. "Like a man walking through fog," she had said. Moreau walked to the precise spot she would have stood when she opened her window. He gazed down at the alley from her vantage point. It provided a partial view, distorted slightly by the perspective. From here, a man standing over Valois might have looked like he was merely kneeling or crouching, making the silhouette difficult to interpret. The lack of panic in his retreat, though, that was what continued to haunt her memory. "Do you think Valois provoked him?" Janvier asked cautiously. "Valois provoked everyone," Moreau said without looking at him. "But provocation doesn't erase intent. Whoever struck that blow did so because something inside him snapped or shifted." "Shifted." Moreau turned from the window. "There are men who kill to silence the world, and men who kill to silence something inside themselves, I suspect. This man belongs to the latter." Janvier absorbed that quietly. They descended again into the alley, standing over the stained stones. Moreau noticed something he had overlooked, a small imprint near a drain. At first glance it seemed trivial, perhaps left by a stray animal, but upon closer inspection he saw the partial pattern of a heel, narrow, likely belonging to a boot of modest craftsmanship. Not the heavy boots worn by dock workers or the polished shoes of wealthy men. A boot made for walking long distances, perhaps through rougher terrains than Paris's streets. "Didn't the widow mention he looked like someone not used to staying in one place?" Janvier asked. "Yes," Moreau murmured. "And she may have been more right than she realized." He imagined the man's life before reaching Paris. A provincial town, perhaps. Long roads, silent nights. A man accustomed to solitude. A man who carried guilt or memory like a second heartbeat. Everything about him felt transient, as though he had no belongings except the weight he bore. Moreau stood again near the center of the alley, his gaze softening as he allowed the scene to come alive around him. The suspect's movements became clearer. He had approached Valois, not with the stride of an attacker, but with the weary determination of someone who had decided, perhaps against his own better nature, that something needed to be done. The blow had been swift, final, but what followed, a pause, a breath, a step back into darkness, spoke volumes. "Inspector," Janvier said, breaking the silence, "you believe the rescue of the child and this killing are connected?" "I do," Moreau replied, his voice low, steady. "Not by circumstance, but by conscience. A man doesn't kill with such stillness unless he's already lived through something that taught him despair, and he doesn't save a child from flames unless he still carries some flicker of hope." Janvier looked puzzled. "So, which is he? A killer or a savior?" Moreau's eyes drifted to the blood-darkened grooves in the cobblestones. "Both, I suspect, and that is what makes him dangerous, not just to others, but to himself." He motioned for Janvier to follow him toward the river. The alley opened onto a narrow embankment walkway where the Seine flowed sluggishly beneath a blanket of mist. Moreau leaned on the stone railing, staring into the water's surface where faint ripples distorted the reflections of nearby lamps. The damp air carried the smell of algae and river mud, evoking memories of past investigations solved along these same banks. "What now?" Janvier asked. "We watch," Moreau said. "Not for him directly, but for the shifts he creates around him. A man like this cannot move through a city without leaving emotional footprints. Someone else will speak of him. Someone else will feel his presence. Do you think he'll kill again?" Moreau shook his head, though uncertainty flickered. Beneath the certainty he projected, "I think he's running from the man who killed Valois, and every act of kindness he performs is an attempt to outrun him." The river flowed on, indifferent yet strangely ominous. Moreau felt a weight gathering on the horizon of this case, like storm clouds forming over calm water. The man was spiraling towards something. Whether redemption or ruin, Moreau couldn't yet say. He turned from the river, exhaling slowly. The alley behind him seemed to hold its breath once more, and he felt a sensation he rarely allowed himself. The faint stir of foreboding. For somewhere in Paris, blood still stained the conscience of a man trying to wash it away with small, desperate acts of goodness. And Moreau knew that such men rarely found peace without first facing whatever truth they feared most. The clue itself was almost nothing. A small folded piece of card that might easily have gone unnoticed had Moreau not insisted on examining Valois' coat one last time. It had been tucked deep into the inner lining, where the seam had frayed just enough to allow the corner to peek out like a shy confession. When Moreau eased it free, the paper crackled softly, the ink faded by time and handling. A provincial train ticket. One way. Issued 3 weeks before the killing. Destination. A small town whose name most Parisians would skim past without a second thought. Just another dot along the sprawling map of France. It was the kind of place where people recognized each other's footsteps on the street before hearing the knock on the door. Moreau studied the name for a long moment, feeling that quiet inner tug he had come to recognize as more reliable than any hunch spoken aloud. Valois, a smuggler who lived by Paris's shifting shadows, had taken a deliberate trip to such a town. There would have been a reason, and the reason would not be innocent. The suspect, the pale man with the candle and the silent guilt, seemed tethered to that ticket, though the thread between them was not yet visible. It was enough, however, to draw Moreau away from the damp familiarity of the Seine and onto a train heading into the provinces, leaving Paris behind beneath a slowly lifting veil of mist. The journey was not long, but it was slow enough to allow thought to stretch out and settle. Outside the window, the landscape rolled by in muted tones, bare trees reaching thin branches toward a washed-out sky, fields still clinging to the memory of harvest, small clusters of houses gathered like families huddled against the quiet. Moreau sat alone in his compartment, pipe resting in the pocket of his coat, hands folded as though prayerful. He did not sleep on such journeys. Instead, he let his mind drift through the details, the contradictions, the emotional fragments that clung to the case. A man kills Valois in a narrow Paris alley with a single measured blow. That same man appears with a candle in a courtyard to save a child from flames. Before that, he lifts a widow's groceries, returns her coins, watches over her from a distance like a restless guardian. He moves with the caution of someone who knows he is being hunted, yet his actions betray a need to be seen, not as the law would see him, but as he wishes to believe he might still become. Somewhere inside that contradiction, Moreau sensed the key to everything. The train slowed as it drew near the town. From the window, the station appeared almost timid, a small, soot-marked building with only 2 platforms and a scattering of benches. A single station master moved along the edge with unhurried steps, checking the time as though confirming that nothing surprising had happened in years. As Moreau stepped onto the platform, the difference from Paris struck him immediately. Here, the air was cleaner, carrying the scent of damp earth and chimneys rather than river fog and coal smoke. Voices were fewer, quieter, and faces turned openly toward him, taking in the stranger in the dark coat with mild suspicion. He approached the station master first. The man, with his grey cap and neatly trimmed mustache, greeted him politely but guardedly. When Moreau introduced himself and showed his identification, a subtle change passed through the man's expression. Not fear, but a sharpening of attention. Small towns were used to gossip, not to inspectors from the Quai des Orfèvres. "I am looking into the movements of a man who came through here 3 weeks ago," Moreau said. "He used a ticket issued to Paris from this station." The station master frowned, thinking, 3 weeks. "Many pass through, Inspector, but not so many that I wouldn't recall someone unusual." He paused, then nodded slowly. "There was one fellow, yes. Tall, thin, coat too big for him, as if it had belonged to someone else once. He kept his eyes down, didn't speak unless spoken to, bought his ticket quietly and waited alone even though the waiting room was nearly empty." "Did he seem nervous?" The man shook his head. "Not nervous. Tired. Tired in that way you see with men who have walked too far and know they must keep walking." Moreau recognized the description instantly. It fit the widow's account. It fit the patrolman's. It fit the shadow of a man saving a child, then vanishing. "Did he speak to anyone?" He asked what time the last train back to Paris was. The station master replied. "I told him. He didn't buy a return ticket, though. Just listened as if he wanted to know if he could escape again quickly if he needed to." "And before he returned to Paris?" Moreau asked. The station master glanced toward the village road leading away from the station. He left on foot. No luggage. Walked as though he already knew the streets. When he came back that evening, his coat was dusty, and there was a look in his eyes. I can't quite name it. Like something heavy had settled over him. He nearly missed the train. Stood near the far end of the platform until the last moment, then climbed aboard just as the whistle blew. Moreau thanked him and followed the road into the town. The streets were narrow but clean, lined with houses that bore the same modest dignity as the station. Curtains lifted slightly as he passed. People noticed. It did not take long to find the cafe near the small square, the kind of place where every newcomer was catalogued within seconds. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of coffee, wine, and something stewed on a back stove. Men sat at simple tables, some playing cards, others merely watching the day go by through the streaked windows. When Moreau ordered a coffee and mentioned the date of the stranger's visit, a few heads turned. It was not fear he saw, but discomfort. Conversations that had flowed easily moments before now hesitated, stalling in mid-sentence like carriages meeting an unexpected obstruction. The cafe owner, a broad man with kind eyes, placed the cup before him and lingered instead of returning to the counter. "You're from Paris," the owner said quietly. "We heard about Valois." Moreau did not immediately reveal how close he was to the case. "You knew him?" A shadow passed over the man's features. "Knew of him? Men like Valois don't need introductions. When they arrive, trouble arrives behind them." "And the tall stranger?" Moreau asked gently. "The one who came through 3 weeks ago?" The cafe owner's fingers tensed around the tray. He lowered his voice further. "He came in here, yes. Sat at that table near the window. Ordered nothing at first. Just watched the square as if searching for a particular door. After a while, he asked me if there was a woman named Claire who still lived near the church." "Claire who?" He didn't know her surname, he said, but he described her. Brown hair, a scar near her eyebrow from falling as a child, eyes that looked like she was always waiting for something. I recognized her. Everyone here does. She left some years ago, went to Paris. The owner glanced at Moreau with a faint, almost accusing curiosity. I told him that. His face changed, as if whatever hope he'd brought with him died right there. Moreau's heartbeat slowed, deepening. "Did he say anything else?" He asked when she left, where she worked, if she ever wrote back. I couldn't answer much. Only that she went with a man from the city, one who promised her fine things. I never saw her again. Valois, Moreau thought. It fit too well. A provincial girl, drawn to Paris by faint promises and dangerous charm. A smuggler like Valois would have taken what he wanted and discarded what he didn't. The stranger's link to her felt painfully clear. "And after that?" Moreau asked. The owner sighed. He finished his drink, barely touched it, and left. He walked toward the church. I saw him sitting on the low wall there, staring at the door as though expecting her to step out after all those years. Moreau visited the church next. It stood slightly apart from the rest of the town, small and stoic, its stone darkened by rain and time. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of incense and old wood. A woman knelt near the front, murmuring prayers. Moreau sat toward the back for a moment, not to pray, but to listen. He imagined the tall stranger seated where he now sat, hat in his hands, eyes lowered, memories pressing in from all sides. In such a place, a man might decide to change, or a man might decide he had nothing left to lose. After leaving, Moreau spoke to an elderly woman who sold candles near the entrance. When he described the stranger, her eyes sharpened with recognition. "Yes," she said. "He bought a single candle, paid too much for it, refused change. He held it like something sacred, then walked away. I watched him light it near the cemetery gate that evening. He stayed there a long time, staring at the flame. It was a cold night. He didn't seem to notice. A candle. Again the candle." Moreau followed the path toward the cemetery. The iron gate creaked slightly as he pushed it open. The stones inside stood in silent rows, bearing names and dates that spoke of quiet lives, sudden departures, forgotten sorrows. He walked slowly between them until he noticed it. A small patch of disturbed earth near one of the older graves, the soil dark and slightly raised, as though someone had recently knelt there. At the base of the stone, wax had hardened in thin rivulets where a candle had burned down almost entirely. He knelt and read the inscription. A simple name, Claire. No surname. Just Claire. Beloved daughter, taken too soon. The date of death, 2 years ago. The wind moved lightly through the trees as Moreau remained kneeling, his hand resting against the cold stone. The story unfolded, not in words, but in impressions. A provincial love, a girl taken to Paris by Valois, a life that ended early, perhaps harshly, sent back to this town in a wooden box. A man who arrived too late, carrying in his heart the wreckage of what might have been. A candle lit at her grave, a man returning to Paris afterward with more than grief in his chest, with purpose. The line between vengeance and justice was thin enough to cut the palms of anyone who tried to hold it. Moreau rose slowly, the pieces falling into place with a painful clarity. The man who had killed Valois had not done so for profit or survival. He had done it for Claire, for the ghost of a life stolen before it could truly begin. As he walked back toward the station in the fading light, Moreau understood with fresh certainty why the man had saved the child from flames, why he left coins at a widow's door, why he hovered like a quiet guardian over streets where sorrow lived openly. He was trying, with every step, to argue with the part of himself that had delivered that fatal blow in the alley. The train back to Paris waited on the tracks, engine breathing faintly. Moreau climbed aboard, feeling the weight of the town linger on his shoulders like a shawl of unanswered questions. The suspect was no longer just a figure in a file. He was a man broken in two, walking a line that could not hold forever. As the train pulled away and the small station receded into the gloom, Moreau knew that the next time their paths crossed, the conversation between them would be about far more than a crime. It would be about love, loss, and the impossible hope that a killer might, in the quietest of ways, become something close to a hero. By the time Inspector Moreau returned to Paris the next morning, the city had already begun reshaping the story in ways only Paris could, taking a private sorrow, a single act of violence, and weaving it into something larger, something that drifted through cafes and newsstands like a wandering spirit. Rumors had multiplied overnight, carried from table to table by men who fancied themselves experts in crime simply because they read the newspapers with their morning absinthe. The Silent Samaritan, as the press had christened the man, no longer belonged to the truth. He belonged to Paris, and Paris had decided he was fascinating. Moreau stepped out of the Gare d'Austerlitz with a heaviness in his chest, the murmur of travelers rising and falling around him like the tide. His train compartment still carried the cold of the provincial night, and the memories of Claire's grave, the melted wax, and the way the wind had seemed to mourn with him clung stubbornly to his thoughts. He lit his pipe as he crossed the courtyard, seeking comfort in its familiar scent. At the cafe near the station entrance, two men leaned over a newspaper, speaking in excited tones. Moreau slowed his steps without appearing to eavesdrop. "They say he saved that child from a burning building," one man whispered. "And the widow on Rue Saint-Denis, she claims he helped her more than once," the other replied. "Imagine that, a killer who rescues children and widows. Only in Paris." Their laughter was soft, more curious than mocking. Moreau exhaled smoke slowly. The story had slipped out of his control. A man who was already tormented by guilt did not need a city's fantasies pressing upon him like a crown he had not asked to wear. Walking toward the Quai des Orfèvres, Moreau felt the city watching him, more precisely, watching for him. People glanced twice, lowered their voices, exchanged speculative nods. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation, and that troubled him more deeply than any public panic might have. A city fascinated by a killer either elevates him or condemns him, rarely anything in between. Inside headquarters, Janvier met him with a stack of newspapers and an expression tight with unease. "You've seen them?" he asked. "On my way in," Moreau replied. "The city is flattering itself again." Janvier laid the newspapers on Moreau's desk. Headlines blared in ink far darker than the truth. "A mysterious guardian in the Paris night, the killer who saves the stranger of the smoke." Moreau flipped through pages filled with embellished accounts, some entirely fabricated. One described the suspect lifting a fallen horse off a carriage driver. Another claimed he had stopped a pickpocket by simply looking at him. Each rumor made Moreau's jaw tighten. The more heroic the man became in public imagination, the more dangerous his next actions could be. Guilt mixed with praise was a volatile combination. "People are starting to see him everywhere," Janvier said, rubbing his temples. "Half the city claims they crossed paths with him last night." "Then half the city is lying," Moreau murmured. "A man like this moves quietly. He doesn't parade himself." Janvier hesitated. "There's more. A reporter from Le Matin wants to speak with you. He says the public deserves a statement." Moreau's expression hardened. "The public deserves accuracy, not fantasies, and I won't feed their appetite for spectacle." After sending Janvier away, Moreau remained alone with the rising hum of Paris outside his window. He thought of Claire, of the stranger's lonely crouch in that provincial cemetery, of the candle burning down into the darkness. He imagined the man wandering through Paris now, carrying that same grief like a wound that refused to scar. Paris was not kind to wounded men. It wrapped them in admiration just long enough to destroy them. By late afternoon, Moreau decided to walk through the city, not as an inspector chasing a suspect, but as a man listening for the pulse of a story that had escaped its boundaries. He moved through the Latin Quarter, where students debated theories of justice with the fervor of men who had never truly tasted its bitterness. He crossed the Pont Saint-Michel, watching the river churn beneath him with sluggish determination. At a small cafe near the riverbank, he overheard two women discussing the man in hushed tones. "One of the papers says he used to work in a monastery," a woman whispered. "Another says he's a former soldier who lost his family in a fire," her companion replied. Their eyes shone with tragic romanticism. Moreau almost smiled, though the gesture carried sorrow rather than amusement. Paris loved a myth more than a man. But as he walked deeper into the evening, something shifted. A different kind of rumor reached his ears, one that tightened his breath. A young patrolman near the boulevard approached him, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Inspector," he said, "I thought you should know. Someone matching the description was seen near the river this morning, standing on the embankment, staring down at the water. They said he looked like he was deciding whether to jump." Moreau's chest constricted. "Did he?" The patrolman shook his head. "No, he walked away, but he looked lost." Lost. That word struck Moreau harder than it should have. He thanked the patrolman and walked toward the river at once, moving with a growing urgency he did not outwardly display. Along the Seine, the lamps cast wavering reflections across the water like fragile threads dragging their light against the current. The city hummed behind him, but the river itself carried a different silence, the silence of men who had stood on its edge with thoughts they dared not voice. He scanned the walkway, searching for signs. Nothing obvious, just footprints near the railing, but they could belong to anyone. Still, Moreau paused, resting his hand on the cold stone. A man who begins to believe he is both monstrous and saintly does not remain balanced for long. Praise could push him toward dangerous courage, self-sacrifice, reckless intervention. But despair could pull him toward something far darker. As night fell, Moreau returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, feeling the heaviness of an approaching storm, the kind that forms not in the sky but in men's hearts. Lucas met him at the entrance, breath uneven. "There's someone here to see you," Lucas said. "A journalist?" "No, a young woman. She looks upset." Moreau stepped quickly into the lobby, where a woman in a worn coat stood wringing her hands, her eyes filled with the weight of an unspoken fear. When she saw him, she froze as though gathering the last of her courage. "You're Inspector Moreau," she whispered. "Yes." She swallowed, trembling. I think I know the man you're looking for." Moreau felt the room tilt ever so slightly. "You've seen him?" "More than seen him," she said. "He lived in my building for a short time. Quiet, gentle, always helping others. But he carried something heavy. I think he's trying to do good because he believes he's already done something unforgivable." Moreau stepped forward. "And where is he now?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I'm afraid he's slipping away, Inspector. If you don't reach him soon, I don't think he'll survive his own guilt." For the first time in days, Moreau felt fear. Not for the city, not for the law, but for a man standing on the edge of himself. She led him up the stairwell as though she feared the building might crumble under the weight of her own footsteps. The narrow corridor smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and damp plaster, the scent of too many tenants living too close to one another. Moreau followed quietly, listening not just to the creak of old wood beneath their feet, but to the tremor in her breathing, a tremor that suggested urgency, dread, and something almost protective. When they reached the third floor, she stopped before a door whose paint had peeled in long, curling strips, as though it had weathered too many winters. "He stayed here," she whispered, touching the frame with a kind of reverence. "For a few weeks, maybe less. I didn't count the days. But every one of them felt like he was living on borrowed time." Moreau said nothing. Silence had become his most reliable ally in this case, a space where people felt safe enough to let truth slip through the cracks their caution could not seal. He kept his gaze steady, allowing her the room she needed. "He rented the room from my aunt," she continued, her voice low. "Paid in advance, never caused trouble, carried himself like a man, trying not to disturb the air around him. He barely spoke except to thank us. But even then," she hesitated, searching for words delicate enough to hold her memory of him. "Even then, his voice sounded like someone apologizing for existing." Moreau nodded slowly. "Did he ever give his name?" She shook her head. "Not a real one. He called himself Laurent, but I don't think that was true. The way he said it, it felt like a borrowed coat, something to keep him warm, but not something he intended to keep." Moreau absorbed that carefully. A false name suggested a man fleeing something more personal than the law. "You said he carried something heavy. What did you mean?" She bit her lip, wrestling with the memory, as if uncertain whether revealing it might betray him somehow. "I saw him one night in the hallway. It was late. I had gone out to bring in the laundry because it had started to rain. He stood there in the half-dark, coat on, hands shaking. Not from cold, from something inside him." She drew a trembling breath. "He told me to go back inside. Said the night wasn't safe for someone as kind as me. And his eyes, they looked like a man begging the world to forgive him for something he hadn't yet confessed." Moreau felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Did he ever mention Valois?" "No." She blinked, then spoke more firmly. "But he mentioned a woman, not by name. He said he had come to Paris because he owed someone the truth, even if she would never hear it. Claire. Of course. The shadow of her grave stretched all the way into this corridor. "What happened while he lived here?" Moreau asked, his voice gentle. "He helped everyone," she whispered, almost helplessly. "Fixed Madame Roux's stove, carried groceries for Monsieur Delorme, fed the cat no one else cared for. It was as if he was trying to patch every crack in the building to make up for the ones inside himself. A man trying to repair the world as penance for something he couldn't undo." The pattern grew sharper with every detail Moreau gathered. "Then one morning," she said, "he was just gone. Room empty, sheets folded. No note, no goodbye. Just a quiet absence." She paused. "But a week later, this arrived." She reached into her coat and produced a crumpled envelope. Its corners were worn, creased as though carried in shaking hands for days before finally being sent. She held it out to Moreau with hesitation. "I haven't shown this to anyone." Moreau took it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, as though written by a man whose thoughts rushed ahead faster than his pen could follow. He broke the seal gently. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The writing slanted inconsistently, marked by moments where the ink darkened from pressure or faltered with hesitation. It was not a confession of crime. It was a confession of despair. He began to read. "I do not know your name, only your kindness. I left because I should not have stayed. People like me do not deserve soft places or gentle voices. I've tried to correct the wrongs I can, but the one I cannot undo follows me like a shadow I cannot outrun. I do not want to be seen as good. I want to disappear before I fail again. If you ever hear that I did something terrible, know that the truth is not simple. I'm not simple. I'm a man broken by my own mistakes. I tried to save someone once, and I was too late. The man who took her from me is gone now. I cannot decide if that makes me a murderer or just a witness to my own ruin. Forgive me for passing through your life like a draught of cold air. You were kind. I remember that." Moreau read it twice. The words trembled with raw honesty, carrying the emotional weight of a man who no longer believed in redemption, but still longed for it in secret. He looked at the young woman. "Why come to me with this now?" Her voice cracked. "Because I saw something in the paper this morning. They're calling him a hero, a guardian. They're turning him into something he never claimed to be, and I'm afraid he'll believe them." Moreau exhaled slowly. "You think he'll seek out danger?" "I think he'll let danger find him," she whispered. He wants punishment. If people keep calling him a savior, he'll look for a way to prove he doesn't deserve it. Those words struck Moreau with a force he did not show on his face. A man who both saves and kills, seeking neither glory nor escape, was a man approaching the threshold where despair might finally consume him. The city's rumors had given him a mask, and a man already haunted by guilt might break himself trying to remove it. "Is there anything else?" Moreau asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "He told me something the night before he left." A single sentence. She lifted her eyes to Moreau's, fear glinting in the dim hallway. He said, "If I cannot return what I took from the world, then I must return myself." I don't know what he meant. Moreau did. A man who feels he owes the world a life he cannot restore may try to replace it with his own. He stepped back from her door and took a slow breath. "Thank you," he said. "You've done the right thing." She nodded, though her expression remained conflicted, torn between loyalty and fear. Moreau descended the stairs with deliberate calm, though inside his mind the urgency surged like the Seine in flood. Outside, the day had darkened, and lamps flickered to life one by one, casting trembling circles of light across the street. He walked toward the river, each step shadowed by the man's words. He imagined him wandering the city now, thin coat pulled close, candle stub in his pocket, eyes that carried the memory of Claire's grave and the weight of his own violence. A man who believed he had forfeited the right to peace could vanish before anyone reached him. Moreau knew what the next chapter would bring. Not an arrest, not a chase, something far more delicate. A confrontation between two men, one who carried the law and one who carried a grief too heavy to name. And somewhere in the city night, the man who had killed Valois was walking slowly toward the edge of himself, searching for some impossible reconciliation between the life he had taken and the lives he had tried to save. Paris was unusually quiet the night Inspector Moreau finally found him. Not silent in the sense of absence, but quiet in the way a city becomes when it senses something about to unfold. The fog rose from the Seine in swollen breaths, drifting between the lamplights like pale ghosts searching for their own reflections. Moreau walked through it steadily, coat buttoned high, pipe unlit in his pocket. He had no wish for distraction. Not tonight. Tonight was the night all the quiet truths of this case would either come undone or crystallize into something irrevocable. He did not hurry. He did not slow. He simply followed the invisible thread that had pulled him through every street, every rumor, every whisper since Valois fell in that alley. A thread woven by guilt, grief, and the faint, unsteady hope of a man who no longer knew how to inhabit his own life. He tracked him not by logic, but by instinct. The instinct that comes from listening to a man's emotional footsteps rather than the physical ones he leaves behind. Moreau knew his patterns now. He gravitated toward quiet places where shadows softened the sharpness of memory. He lingered near people whose frailties reminded him of his own. He disappeared when gratitude came too close, too warm, too dangerous. And when despair rose like a tide, he went to the water. The Seine had become the silent stage of their parallel wandering. It was fitting that the river, which swallowed so many secrets, would be the place where one final truth would rise to the surface. Moreau crossed the Pont Marie and paused halfway, leaning lightly against the stone railing. The river glistened below, dark and restless, catching the faint reflections of lamps above like slivers of trembling gold. He inhaled deeply, letting the cold sting his lungs. Somewhere beneath the rhythmic murmur of the current lay the heartbeat of a man wrestling with himself. The city had given him grand titles: guardian, savior, mysterious protector. But Moreau had seen the truth behind each manufactured layer. The man was not seeking glory, but absolution, and absolution seldom arrives, wrapped in the glow of newspaper praise. It arrives. if at all, in the raw, cold solitude a man enters when he can no longer lie to himself. As Moreau moved off the bridge and descended toward the embankment, he saw him, standing with his back to the path, tall and motionless, coat hanging loosely from his narrow shoulders. A figure carved from melancholy. The fog curled around him like a second skin. His hands rested on the railing, fingers pale and still. He was staring into the water with the posture of a man listening to the river's quiet promise of escape. Moreau approached without sound. He stopped a few paces behind him, enough distance to let the moment breathe. "Laurent," he said softly, using the false name with deliberate gentleness. The man turned slowly. His face, illuminated faintly by the lamplight behind Moreau, bore exhaustion so deep it seemed etched into the bone. His eyes held the fragile clarity of someone who had cried in silence long after his tears had dried. He did not look startled, only tired, as though he had known Moreau would come and had simply been waiting for him to take his place in this final frame. "You found me," the man murmured. His voice was low, unsteady, carrying the faint rasp of someone who had not spoken aloud in some time. "I've been following the path you left behind," Moreau replied. "Not the physical one. The one built from the people you helped. They remember you." A faint, sorrowful smile tugged at the man's mouth. "They shouldn't. But they do." The man looked back toward the river. "You've come to arrest me, then?" Moreau remained silent. This was not a night for bluntness. It was a night for truth. "I killed him," the man said, almost peacefully, as though reciting a line he had practiced over and over in his mind. "Valois, I killed him." Moreau stepped closer, but not too close. "I know." The man's gaze drifted over the dark water. "He took her from me. He stole her life and left her with nothing but fear. By the time I found her, she was no longer the girl I loved. Paris had eaten her hope. And Valois, he walked away without consequence. No remorse, no memory of her. She died believing she deserved nothing better." His voice cracked on that last word. The fog itself seemed to pause. "When I saw him that night," the man continued, "he laughed at something a man said, laughed with the same mouth that promised Claire a future. I felt something break inside me. A sound, a snap. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I just removed him from the world." Moreau let the confession settle, neither judging nor absolving. "And saving the child?" he asked quietly. The man inhaled sharply, grief sparking in his eyes. "She looked like Claire once did. Small, terrified. I couldn't let her burn. Not again." He pressed his hands against the railing, gripping it as though it were the only thing holding him to the earth. "But saving her doesn't erase what I've done, doesn't erase the years I wasted. Doesn't erase the night Claire whispered to me that she wished she had never trusted anyone." His voice softened, barely more than breath. "I failed her long before Valois did." Moreau moved beside him, leaning against the railing, placing himself shoulder to shoulder with him so that neither man had to face the other directly. The river moved below them like a long exhale. "You didn't fail her," Moreau said. "You loved her, you searched for her, you mourned her. That is not failure." The man shook his head slowly. "It feels like it." "Grief feels like many things," Moreau replied. "Failure, anger, emptiness. But grief is not guilt. Guilt belongs to the man you killed, not to you." "And yet," the man whispered, "I am the one who ended a life." Moreau's tone softened, not in pity but in understanding. "You ended violence, not innocence." Silence fell between them, a deep, trembling silence filled with the sound of the water and the distant hum of the city settling further into night. After a long moment, the man spoke again. "What happens now, Inspector?" The question hung heavy, as though he already knew the answers and feared them all. Moreau turned to look at him fully for the first time since approaching. "Now, you come with me. Not because I want to punish you, but because you cannot keep carrying this alone." The man's eyes filled with tears that did not fall. "If I go with you, what will they call me then? Still a hero? Or a murderer?" "Neither," Moreau said gently. "They will call you what you are. A man who did something terrible, and a man who tried to do good. The world rarely allows us to be both. But life does." The man closed his eyes. The wind brushed against them softly, like the faintest benediction. Slowly, so slowly it seemed as though he were lifting the weight of his entire past. He stepped back from the railing. His shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in surrender. A surrender not to the law, but to the truth he could no longer run from. Moreau placed a steady hand on his arm. The man did not flinch. They walked together along the embankment, two figures moving through fog, one guiding, one guided, though neither entirely sure which role belonged to which. As they ascended the stone steps toward the street, the city stirred faintly as if acknowledging their passage. A warm lamplight flickered nearby, and in that small circle of gold, the man paused. He reached into his coat and withdrew a tiny candle stub, the same one he had carried through smoke, through alleys, through nights thick with remorse. He placed it gently on the stone beside the steps, not as a symbol of redemption, but as a quiet farewell to the man he had been. Moreau watched him. The man's voice was barely audible. "I don't know who I am now," Moreau answered with the calm certainty of someone who had solved not just a case, but a human riddle. "You are a man who is still alive, and that is where everything begins." Together, they walked into the waiting night, not toward punishment, not toward grace, but toward the honest, painful path that lies between them.